The morning started like any other, with the smell of roasted coffee beans and the hum of espresso machines filling the air. I stood in line at the Starbucks on Central Avenue, scrolling through my phone, mentally preparing for another day of being invisible at work. That's when I noticed him, sitting alone in the corner by the window. An older man with graying hair and weathered hands, leaning a wooden cane against the table. His army cap was faded, the kind that's been through years of sun and rain, and he was reading an actual newspaper, the Wall Street Journal spread out before him like a relic from another era. He caught my eye not because he looked important, but because he looked forgotten. The way he sat there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes scanning the pages with the focus of someone who still believed the world was worth understanding. Something about that posture, that quiet dignity mixed with weariness, struck a chord in me. Maybe it was because I knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to have value that nobody bothered to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When I reached the counter, I ordered my usual grande latte, and then without thinking too hard about it, I added, and whatever that gentleman in the corner is having. The barista glanced over, nodded, and rang it up. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was $7.50. I didn't expect anything in return, not gratitude, not recognition, nothing. I just wanted someone who had clearly given something to this country to know that at least one person saw him that morning. I took my coffee and left before he could notice who had paid. I didn't want the awkwardness of thanks or the weight of his gratitude. I just wanted to do something decent in a world that had spent the last 6 years teaching me that decency was a luxury reserved for people who already had power. As I walked out into the Phoenix heat, already climbing even though it was barely 7 in the morning, I had no idea that the man I just bought coffee for would become the reason my entire life would shift on its axis. 3 weeks later, I would stand in a conference room across from the most powerful defense officials in the country, and that same man would look me in the eye and say my name with the kind of respect I had spent my entire career begging for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before that moment could happen, I had to survive the worst professional humiliation of my life. I had to watch everything I built get ripped away by people who smiled while they did it. And I had to learn that sometimes the universe keeps score in ways you never see coming. My name is Rachel Bennett, and for 6 years I worked as a senior analyst at Apex Solutions, a mid-sized defense contracting consulting firm tucked into the Camelback Corridor in Phoenix. If you've never heard of us, that's by design. We operated in the shadows of the industry, advising Pentagon officials on procurement strategies, contract negotiations, and resource allocation. The work was complex, demanding, and absolutely critical to how billions of taxpayer dollars moved through the system. It required understanding policy, finance, logistics, and the delicate politics of military brass who didn't always agree on what victory looked like. I was good at it. Not good in the way people throw around compliments at office parties. I mean genuinely, measurably excellent. I could read a defense authorization bill and spot the buried clauses that would jam up a contract 6 months down the line. I understood the procurement cycle better than analysts with twice my experience. I had built relationships with mid-level officials at the Pentagon who trusted my insights because I didn't waste their time with jargon or posturing. I just told them what worked and what didn't, and I was right often enough that they kept calling. But none of that mattered to the people who determined my value at Apex Solutions. To them, I was Rachel, the quiet one. The woman who showed up early, stayed late, and never made a fuss. I didn't play golf with the executives. I didn't attend the happy hours where deals were really made. I didn't have the kind of polished confidence that made people assume competence before you even opened your mouth. I had the actual competence, but in a world that runs on appearance and performance, that's rarely enough. My boss, Vanessa Monroe, was everything I wasn't. Tall, sharply dressed, with the kind of voice that could command a room even when she had nothing important to say. She had come to Apex 3 years ago from a competitor, brought in to lead the operations division with promises of expanding our Pentagon contracts. She was good at selling vision. She could walk into a room of skeptical officials and leave with their confidence, even if the plan she pitched had holes you could drive a truck through. The executives loved her because she looked like success, and in consulting, perception is half the contract. I worked under Vanessa, which meant I did the analysis, built the frameworks, and drafted the proposals that she presented as her own. At first, I told myself this was normal. Junior people support senior leadership. That's how organizations function. But I wasn't junior anymore. I had 6 years of institutional knowledge, dozens of successful projects, and a reputation with clients that should have translated into promotions, raises, visibility. Instead, I got cost of living adjustments and vague promises that my time would come if I just kept doing great work. The breaking point started 4 months before that morning at Starbucks, when Apex landed the opportunity of a lifetime. The Department of Defense was soliciting bids for a massive consulting contract, worth $150 million over 3 years, to overhaul procurement inefficiencies across multiple branches. It was the kind of contract that could define a firm, the kind that turned mid-sized players into industry leaders. Every major consulting group in the country was going after it, and Apex, despite our smaller size, had a legitimate shot because of one reason. We had me. I had spent 2 years cultivating a relationship with a deputy undersecretary who oversaw procurement reform. Not through schmoozing or performative networking, but by actually helping him solve problems. When his team got stuck on a logistics bottleneck in a naval supply chain contract, I sent him a 3-page memo outlining a solution that saved the Navy $14 million. When congressional oversight threatened to derail a modernization initiative, I drafted talking points that helped him navigate the hearing without compromising the program. He didn't owe me anything, but he respected my work, and in Washington, respect is currency. When the RFP dropped, he called me directly. Not Apex Solutions. Not Vanessa Monroe. Me. He told me the selection committee was looking for a partner who understood both the policy side and the operational realities, someone who could bridge the gap between Pentagon leadership and the defense contractors who actually delivered the goods. He said if we submitted a proposal that reflected that understanding, we'd be taken seriously. It was as close to an invitation as you get in government contracting. I brought this to Vanessa the same day. I walked into her office, which overlooked the Scottsdale skyline with floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were floating above the city, and I laid out the opportunity. I explained the relationship, the inside track we had, and the structure I thought our proposal should take. She listened, nodding occasionally, her fingers steepled in that way people do when they want to look thoughtful. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "This is incredible work, Rachel. Really impressive initiative." She paused, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe this time would be different. "I'm going to take this to Derek and the executive team. We need to move fast if we're going to put together a winning bid." I should have asked right then to be included in those meetings. I should have insisted that my name be attached to the proposal from the beginning. But I didn't. I told myself that Vanessa understood my role, that the executives knew who had brought this in, that my work would speak for itself. I had spent 6 years believing that doing excellent work quietly would eventually be rewarded. I still believed in merit, in fairness, in the idea that organizations recognize the people who actually make things happen. I was wrong. Over the next 3 months, I worked 16-hour days building that proposal. I researched every comparable contract the DoD had issued in the past decade. I analyzed what worked, what failed, and why. I built financial models that demonstrated cost savings. I drafted implementation timelines that accounted for bureaucratic delays and political transitions. I wrote policy briefs, case studies, and risk assessments. I coordinated with our finance team, our legal advisors, and our operational leads to make sure every section of the proposal was airtight. Vanessa held weekly meetings to review progress, and I presented my work at each one. She would nod, take notes, occasionally ask a clarifying question, and then thank me for my contributions. The executives attended some of these meetings, including Derek Caldwell, our managing director, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and a handshake that felt like a performance. He would smile at me, say things like, "Great stuff, Rachel," and "Keep it up," but his eyes were always on Vanessa. She was the person he saw as leading this effort, and I was just the analyst doing the background work. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. But I wanted to believe that this time, when the contract came through, when we won this thing that I had built from the ground up, they would finally acknowledge what I had done. I wanted to believe that 6 years of loyalty and excellence would mean something. The proposal was submitted on a Friday in late September. I had worked through the night to finalize the last sections, proofreading every page, checking every citation, making sure the formatting was flawless. When I finally uploaded the document to the DoD portal at 4 in the morning, I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. It was done. It was good. We had a real chance. Vanessa sent an email to the entire team that afternoon, thanking everyone for their hard work and celebrating the submission. My name was mentioned once, in a list of contributors, sandwiched between the finance lead and the legal advisor. No special acknowledgement. No recognition of the fact that this entire proposal existed because of the relationship I had built and the hundreds of hours I had poured into making it real. Just my name in a list, as if I had done the same amount of work as someone who reviewed a budget spreadsheet. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was what mattered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If we won, everyone would know. If we won, I would finally get the visibility I deserved. We won. The notification came 6 weeks later, in early November. The DoD had selected Apex Solutions for the $150 million contract. It was the biggest deal in the firm's history, the kind of win that would define the next decade of growth. The office erupted in celebration. Champagne appeared in the break room. Derek called an all-hands meeting to announce the news, his voice booming with pride as he described this as a transformational moment for the company. I stood in the back of the conference room, surrounded by colleagues who were cheering and clapping, and I waited for my name to be called. I waited for Derek to acknowledge the person who had made this possible. I waited for Vanessa to step forward and give credit where it was due. Derek thanked the executive team for their strategic vision. He praised Vanessa for her leadership and her ability to deliver under pressure. He talked about the future of Apex, about the doors this contract would open, about the legacy we were building. He never said my name. Not once. After the meeting, people congratulated Vanessa. They shook her hand, patted her on the back, told her she'd done an incredible job. She accepted it all with gracious smiles, thanking the team, talking about how proud she was of everyone's contributions. I stood there, watching, feeling something inside me crack. I approached her afterward, when the crowd had thinned. My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking. Vanessa, I just wanted to check in about next steps. I assume I'll be leading the implementation team, given my relationship with the client? She looked at me with something close to surprise, as if the question itself was odd. Oh, Rachel, we're still figuring out the structure. Derek wants to bring in some senior people to manage a contract this size. You'll definitely be involved, of course. Your analysis work has been invaluable. Invaluable. The word people use when they want to acknowledge your work without giving you power. I brought this contract in, I said quietly. The deputy undersecretary called me. I built the entire proposal. Vanessa's expression shifted, not to anger but to something worse. Pity. Rachel, I know you worked really hard on this. Everyone did. But landing a contract like this takes more than analysis. It takes relationships at the executive level, strategic positioning, and frankly, credibility with DoD leadership. That's what I brought to the table. That's what Derek and the board value. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if it were simply true, as if my 2 years of building trust with the client didn't count because I didn't have the right title or the right presence in the room. As if the work itself was secondary to the performance of leadership. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I just nodded, thanked her for her time, and walked back to my desk. I sat down, stared at my computer screen, and felt the weight of 6 years pressing down on me. 6 years of showing up early and staying late. 6 years of doing the work that mattered while other people took the credit. 6 years of believing that excellence would be enough. It wasn't. That night, I went home to my small apartment in Tempe, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat on my balcony staring at the distant glow of downtown Phoenix. I thought about quitting. I thought about sending an email to the entire company explaining exactly what had happened, exposing the lie that Vanessa had sold. But I knew how that story would end. I would be labeled as bitter, difficult, someone who couldn't handle not being in the spotlight. They would close ranks, protect their narrative, and I would be left with nothing but burned bridges and a reputation as a troublemaker. So I did what I had always done. I stayed quiet. I went back to work the next day and smiled when people congratulated Vanessa. I sat in meetings where she talked about our strategy and our approach using frameworks I had built. I watched her get promoted to senior vice president 2 weeks later, with a raise and a corner office that looked out over Camelback Mountain. And I kept working, because I didn't know what else to do. I told myself that maybe this was just how the world worked. Maybe I was naive to think it could be different. Maybe the best I could hope for was to keep doing good work and accept that the rewards would always go to someone else. But deep down, something had shifted. The crack that had started the day of that celebration had widened into something I couldn't ignore. I didn't have a plan yet. I didn't know how to fight back against a system that had been designed to keep people like me in the background. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being invisible. I started going to that Starbucks every morning at 6:45. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, just a new routine that formed in the weeks after the contract announcement. I needed somewhere to sit before work, somewhere that wasn't my apartment where the walls felt too close, and wasn't the office where every conversation reminded me of what had been taken. The Starbucks on Central Avenue became that place. It was always busy enough that I could disappear into the crowd, but never so packed that I couldn't find a seat. That's where I kept seeing him. The veteran with the cane and the faded army cap. He came in around the same time I did, ordered black coffee, and sat in the same corner spot by the window. He never looked at his phone. He read the newspaper, sometimes a book, and he had this way of sitting that suggested he was completely comfortable being alone with his thoughts. In a world where everyone seemed desperate to fill silence with noise, there was something almost radical about his stillness. I started buying his coffee without him knowing. The baristas caught on after the first week, and they'd just nod when I ordered. I'd leave before he noticed, walking out into the desert morning that was already starting to heat up, and I'd head to work where I would spend another day being professionally erased. It became a small act of defiance, a way of asserting that I still believed in recognizing value even when no one recognized mine. One morning in early December, about 3 weeks after I'd started this routine, he was there before me. I walked in and saw him at his usual spot, but this time he was talking to someone. A younger man in a suit, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of haircut that costs more than most people spend on groceries. They were having an intense conversation, the kind where both people lean forward and speak in low voices. I ordered my coffee and his, but when the barista called out the second drink, the younger man had already left and the veteran looked up. Our eyes met. He had the kind of gaze that made you feel seen, really seen, not just looked at. He glanced at the coffee the barista was holding, then back at me, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or just understanding. He nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and then returned to his newspaper. I picked up both drinks, walked over to his table, and set his coffee down without saying anything. "You've been doing this for a while," he said. His voice was rough but warm, the kind of voice that had given orders and told stories and probably offered comfort in difficult moments. "It's just coffee," I said. "It's never just coffee." He folded his newspaper and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Do you have a minute, or are you rushing off to save the world?" I should have left. I should have smiled politely and said I had to get to work. But something about the way he asked, like he genuinely wanted to know the answer, made me sit down. We talked for 20 minutes that morning. He didn't ask me what I did for work, didn't pry into why I looked tired or why I bought coffee for strangers. Instead, he asked me about Phoenix, about whether I was from here or had moved for work, about what I thought of the city's growth and whether it still felt like the desert or if all the development had buried that. I found myself talking more than I had in weeks. Not about work, not about Vanessa or the contract or any of the things that were eating at me, but about smaller things. About how I'd come here for graduate school and stayed because I liked the mountains and the way the sunset turned the sky purple. About how the city felt like it was trying to become something it wasn't, trading its character for glass towers and tech campuses. He listened the way people rarely do anymore, with his full attention, without checking his watch or glancing at his phone. When I finally looked at the time and realized I was going to be late, I stood up quickly and apologized. He waved it off. "I'm Tom, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "Rachel," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm despite the age in his hands. "Thank you for the coffee, Rachel. And for the conversation. Both matter more than you might think." I left feeling lighter than I had in months, which was strange because nothing about my actual situation had changed. Vanessa was still taking credit for my work. Derek was still ignoring my contributions. The contract I had built was being implemented by a team I wasn't even part of. But something about that conversation, about being seen by someone who had no agenda and no reason to diminish me, reminded me that I still existed outside of the boxes other people tried to put me in. Work continued to deteriorate. In mid-December, Apex held its annual holiday party at a resort in Scottsdale, one of those events where everyone pretends to be friendly while silently calculating who's moving up and who's being left behind. Vanessa arrived in a designer dress, Derek at her side, and they worked the room like politicians at a fundraiser. I stood near the bar, nursing a glass of wine and watching the performance. One of my colleagues, Kevin Walsh, approached me. Kevin was a team lead in operations, someone I'd worked with on several projects over the years. He was decent enough, competent but not exceptional, the kind of person who survived in corporate environments by never making waves. "Hell of a year for Vanessa," he said, gesturing toward where she stood surrounded by executives. "Hell of a year for Apex," I corrected. He looked at me with something like sympathy. "You know, people know you did a lot of the heavy lifting on that DoD contract. It's not like it's a secret. Then why does it feel like one?" I said it more sharply than I intended. Kevin shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Rachel, this is just how it works. The people at the top get the credit. That's the game. You're good at what you do, everyone knows that, but if you want recognition, you have to play the political game. Vanessa's good at that. You're not. So the solution is to become someone I'm not. The solution is to accept reality." He said it kindly, but that somehow made it worse. He wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed what he was saying, that this was just the way things were and the only choice was to accept it or leave. I finished my wine and left the party early. On the drive home, I passed the Starbucks where I'd met Tom that morning, and I thought about his words. It's never just coffee. He was right. Nothing is ever just what it appears to be on the surface. Every interaction, every gesture, every choice carries weight. I had spent 6 years making choices that diminished myself, that prioritized being agreeable over being valued. I had chosen to stay quiet, to do the work without demanding recognition, to believe that the system would eventually reward merit. Kevin was right about one thing. That was reality. But reality isn't fixed. It's made by the people who have the courage to reject what is and fight for what should be. I just didn't know yet how to fight a battle where the rules were designed to keep people like me from winning. The week between Christmas and New Year's was quiet at the office. Most people took vacation, and the skeleton crew that remained moved through the halls like ghosts. I used the time to do something I'd been avoiding. I went through every project I'd worked on over the past 6 years and documented my contributions. Not in the vague language of corporate speak, but in concrete terms. Contracts won because of my analysis. Relationships built because of my outreach. Problems solved because of frameworks I developed. By the time I finished, I had a 40-page document that laid out, in undeniable detail, the value I had created for Apex Solutions. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. Part of me wanted to send it to Derek, to force him to see what he'd been overlooking. But I knew how that would be received. It would look like desperation, like I was begging for recognition. And even if he read it, even if he acknowledged the truth of what I'd written, it wouldn't change anything. The people at the top don't reward the people who do the work. They reward the people who look like leaders, who perform confidence, who know how to take credit without appearing greedy. I saved the document in a folder on my personal laptop and closed it. Maybe someday it would matter. Maybe someday I'd need evidence of what I'd built. But for now, it was just a record, a way of telling myself that I wasn't crazy, that my contributions were real even if no one else wanted to acknowledge them. January arrived with the kind of cold that Phoenix gets in winter, where the mornings are sharp and clear and the desert light makes everything look more vivid. I went back to my routine at Starbucks, and Tom was there, same spot, same newspaper. We started talking more regularly. Not every day, but a few times a week. He never asked what I did for work, and I never asked about his military service. We talked about books, about politics in the abstract way that people do when they're trying to understand the world without getting mired in the ugliness of it. He had opinions, strong ones, but he never lectured. He asked questions that made me think harder about what I believed and why. One morning in late January, after I'd bought his coffee and joined him at his table, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Do you like what you do?" I paused, coffee cup halfway to my lips. "I'm good at what I do." That's not what I asked. I set the cup down and looked out the window at the people rushing past on their way to offices and meetings and lives that probably felt just as complicated as mine. I said finally. I used to think it mattered. That the work I did made a difference, even if it was just helping the government spend money more efficiently. But lately it feels like I'm just feeding a machine that doesn't care whether I exist or not. Tom nodded slowly. I've known a lot of people who felt that way. Good people, talented people, who got ground down by systems that didn't value them. Some of them left. Some of them stayed and got bitter. A few of them figured out how to change the system from the inside. How? By refusing to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. He said it simply, like it was obvious, but there was weight behind the words. The people who change systems aren't the ones who play by the rules. They're the ones who understand the rules well enough to rewrite them. I thought about that conversation for days. Rewrite the rules. It sounded inspiring in theory, but I had no idea what that looked like in practice. I wasn't an executive. I didn't have a network of powerful allies. I didn't have leverage. What I had was expertise, relationships with mid-level government officials who respected my work, and a growing sense that I couldn't keep living in a world where my value was determined by people who refused to see it. In early February, something shifted. The DoD contract that Vanessa was supposedly leading hit a snag. The implementation plan that the team had developed, a plan I hadn't been involved in creating, didn't align with the Pentagon's operational realities. The officials who were supposed to approve the next phase pushed back, raising concerns about timelines and resource allocation. Vanessa tried to smooth it over with conference calls and reassurances, but the people on the other end weren't buying it. They wanted someone who understood the details, someone who could answer technical questions without corporate jargon. They asked for me. The request came through official channels, an email from the Deputy Undersecretary's office asking if Rachel Bennett could join the next implementation meeting. When Vanessa saw it, I watched her face tighten. She forwarded the email to me with a brief note. "Looks like they want your input on some technical details. Please prepare a briefing for next week's call." I prepared. Not just a briefing, but a complete analysis of where the implementation had gone wrong and how to fix it. I identified the gaps between what we'd promised in the proposal and what the current team was actually delivering. I outlined a revised approach that would get the project back on track and rebuild trust with the client. And I documented every single conversation I'd had with Pentagon officials over the past 2 years, every relationship I'd built, every piece of institutional knowledge that made me uniquely qualified to lead this contract. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in mid-February. It was supposed to be a video call, routine and forgettable. Vanessa would lead, would provide technical support, and we'd move forward. But the night before the meeting, I got a phone call from the Deputy Undersecretary's office. Not an email, a phone call. The assistant on the other end told me that the Secretary of Defense himself wanted to sit in on the call. It was unusual, she said, but he was taking a personal interest in the procurement reform initiative and wanted to hear directly from the people doing the work. My heart hammered in my chest. The Secretary of Defense. I'd never met him, never even been in a room where he was present. He was a figure you read about in the news, someone so far removed from the day-to-day work of a mid-level analyst that he might as well have been fictional. And now he was going to be on a call where I was supposed to present technical details about contract implementation. I didn't sleep that night. I ran through my presentation a dozen times, anticipating questions, refining explanations, making sure I could speak clearly and confidently even with the most powerful person in the defense establishment listening. When Tuesday morning came, I arrived at the office an hour early and set up in one of the small conference rooms. Vanessa joined 10 minutes before the call, looking calm and polished as always. "Just let me handle the opening," she said. "You can jump in when they ask technical questions." The call connected. Faces appeared on the screen. The Deputy Undersecretary, 2 of his senior staff, a contracts officer I'd worked with before. And then, in a small box in the corner, a face I recognized but couldn't immediately place. An older man, gray hair, strong features, wearing a suit instead of a uniform. He wasn't on camera from an office. He was somewhere else, somewhere that looked like a coffee shop. The Deputy Undersecretary started the meeting with introductions, thanking everyone for their time and noting that the Secretary had joined to hear the update. Vanessa launched into her prepared remarks, talking about Apex's commitment to excellence and our strategy for moving forward. I watched the Secretary's face on the screen. He wasn't looking at Vanessa. He was looking at something off camera, and then his eyes shifted, and he looked directly into his camera, directly at the screen, and I realized with a jolt that sent electricity through my entire body that I knew that face. It was Tom. The veteran from Starbucks. The man I'd been buying coffee for. The man I'd sat with and talked to about Phoenix and politics and the weight of systems that didn't value the people who made them work. Tom wasn't just a disabled veteran. He was Thomas Garrison, Secretary of Defense, one of the most powerful people in the entire federal government. My breath caught. I couldn't move. Vanessa was still talking, but I couldn't hear the words anymore. Tom, Secretary Garrison, looked at the screen with that same calm, assessing gaze I'd seen across the table at Starbucks, and when Vanessa finally paused, he spoke. "Ms. Monroe, I appreciate the overview, but I'm actually here to hear from Ms. Bennett." "Rachel, are you on the call?" Vanessa's face went pale. Every other face on the screen turned toward their cameras, as if they could see me through the pixels. I forced myself to breathe, to find my voice. "Yes, sir. I'm here." "Good. I've reviewed the contract file and the correspondence from my team. It's clear you're the person who actually understands this project. Walk me through where we are and what needs to happen next." No corporate language. Just the truth. I took a breath and started talking. My voice was steady, clearer than I expected it to be. I explained the current status of the implementation, the gaps between the proposal and what was actually being delivered, and the specific concerns that had been raised by the operational teams on the ground. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I didn't use the kind of corporate speak that turns failure into learning opportunities and problems into challenges. I just told the truth in language that anyone could understand. The procurement timeline had been compressed without consulting the people who actually had to execute the work. The resource allocation didn't match the staffing realities at 3 of the key installations. The technology integration plan assumed infrastructure that didn't exist yet and wouldn't exist for at least 6 months. These weren't small issues. They were fundamental misalignments that would cause the entire project to collapse if they weren't addressed immediately. As I talked, I watched Secretary Garrison's face on the screen. He was listening with the same intensity he brought to our conversations at Starbucks, that quality of attention that made you feel like every word mattered. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. The Deputy Undersecretary looked uncomfortable. His staff were taking notes frantically. Vanessa sat beside me rigid as stone, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. Thank you, Rachel, Secretary Garrison said. That's the most honest assessment I've heard since this contract was awarded. Now tell me what we need to do to fix it. I walked through my proposal. We needed to extend the initial implementation phase by 8 weeks to allow for proper groundwork. We needed to reallocate resources to match the actual capacity at each site rather than the theoretical capacity someone had put in a spreadsheet. We needed to bring in the operational commanders from each installation and get their input before we finalized technical specifications, because the people doing the work always knew things the planners didn't. And we needed clear lines of authority so that when decisions had to be made quickly, there wasn't a committee of executives debating while the project stalled. Who should have that authority? He asked. The question hung in the air. Everyone on the call knew what he was really asking. Vanessa shifted in her seat beside me. I could feel her willing me to defer, to say something diplomatic about collaborative leadership and team approaches. But Secretary Garrison wasn't asking for diplomacy. He was asking for the truth. Someone who understands both the policy framework and the operational realities, I said. Someone the people on the ground trust to make decisions that actually work, not decisions that look good in PowerPoint presentations. Someone who's been involved from the beginning and knows why we made the commitments we made. Someone like you, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Someone like me. Vanessa inhaled sharply. The deputy undersecretary glanced at someone off camera and then back at the screen. Secretary Garrison nodded once, that same small gesture of acknowledgement I'd seen at the coffee shop. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Ms. Bennett, you're now the primary point of contact for this contract. All implementation decisions go through you. You'll report directly to the Deputy Undersecretary's office, and you'll have full authority to make operational calls without waiting for committee approval. Ms. Monroe, your firm will continue to provide support services, but leadership of this project has just changed hands. If there's a problem with that arrangement, we can revisit the contract terms entirely. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order delivered with the kind of casual authority that comes from having actual power rather than just the appearance of it. Vanessa's face had gone from pale to red, but she managed to keep her voice controlled. Of course, Mr. Secretary. We're committed to ensuring the project succeeds however you think is best. Good. Rachel, my office will reach out this afternoon to set up a direct line of communication. I want weekly updates, not filtered through corporate channels. Just you and the Deputy Undersecretary, and I'll join when needed. Any questions? I had 1,000 questions, but the only one that mattered right now was whether this was real, whether the man I'd bought coffee for had just rewritten the power structure of the biggest contract of my career because he knew I was the person actually doing the work. But I didn't ask that. I just said, no questions, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're about to find out that leading is harder than analyzing. But I think you're ready for it. He glanced at something off screen. I have another call. Deputy, let's touch base this evening about next steps. The screen went dark. The call was over. I sat in the small conference room staring at the blank monitor, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Beside me, Vanessa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. My office. Now. I followed her down the hallway, past cubicles where people were pretending to work while clearly trying to overhear what was happening. Vanessa's office door closed behind us with a heavy click. She stood behind her desk, arms crossed, and for a long moment she just stared at me. What the hell was that? Her voice was low and controlled, but there was fury underneath it. That was the client requesting a change in project leadership. Don't play games with me, Rachel. You went around me. You talked to the Secretary of Defense without telling anyone. You positioned yourself as the hero and made me look incompetent in front of the most important client we have. I didn't go around anyone, I said, keeping my voice level. The Deputy Undersecretary asked for me specifically because their team had questions about the implementation. I answered those questions honestly. That's all. Honestly, she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. You undermined months of work by telling them the plan was flawed. You made Apex look like we don't know what we're doing. Do you have any idea what you've just done to our reputation? I told them the truth. The plan is flawed. It was going to fail, and when it did, Apex's reputation would have been destroyed for real. Now we have a chance to fix it before that happens. Vanessa leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. You don't get to make those decisions. You're an analyst. Your job is to provide information, not to set strategy, and certainly not to negotiate project leadership with the Secretary of Defense behind my back. I didn't negotiate anything. He made that decision. Because you manipulated the situation. Because somehow you have a relationship with him that you never disclosed. That's a conflict of interest, Rachel. That's potentially grounds for termination. The accusation was absurd and we both knew it. There was no conflict of interest in buying someone coffee and having conversations about Phoenix politics. But Vanessa wasn't interested in what was true. She was interested in reasserting control, in putting me back in the box where I belonged so that the hierarchy she depended on could remain intact. If you want to fire me, that's your choice, I said. But the secretary just put me in charge of a $150 million contract. If I'm not here, that contract goes into immediate jeopardy. So you need to decide what matters more. Your ego or Apex's future. It was the first time in 6 years I'd spoken to her like that, without deference or careful political calculation. The first time I'd stated clearly what we both knew but never acknowledged. That I had power now, real power, and she couldn't simply erase me anymore. Her jaw tightened. Get out of my office. I left without another word. When I got back to my desk, my phone was already buzzing with messages. One from the Deputy Undersecretary's office with contact information and meeting times. One from Derek's assistant asking me to come to his office at the end of the day. One from Kevin Walsh that just said, "Holy shit, what just happened?" And one from a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. This is Tom. Or I suppose I should say Secretary Garrison now that the cat's out of the bag. Thank you for the coffee all those mornings. And thank you for being someone who values honesty over performance. That's rare. We need to talk soon, but not over email. I'll have my office set something up. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down heavily in my chair and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, my entire professional life had been turned upside down. I was now leading the most important project in Apex's history. I had direct access to the Secretary of Defense. And I had just made an enemy of the person who controlled my salary, my promotion prospects, and my day-to-day existence at this company. The rest of the day passed in a blur. People kept stopping by my desk, some congratulating me, others fishing for information about how I knew Secretary Garrison, all of them trying to figure out where they stood now that the power dynamics had shifted. I answered questions vaguely, focused on my work, and tried to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. At 4 o'clock, I went to Derek's office. He was standing by the window when I entered, looking out at the Scottsdale skyline with his hands in his pockets. He didn't turn around immediately. That was quite a performance this morning, he said finally. It wasn't a performance. It was a project update. He turned to face me, and his expression was difficult to read. Not angry exactly, but calculating. Rachel, I'm going to be direct with you. What happened today puts this firm in a complicated position. On one hand, the client clearly wants you leading this project. That's good for the contract. On the other hand, you just undermined your direct supervisor in front of the most important audience possible. That creates management problems. I didn't undermine anyone. I answered questions about work I've been doing for 2 years. The perception is what matters. And the perception is that you went over Vanessa's head, cultivated a personal relationship with a senior government official, and used that relationship to advance your own position at her expense. Is that what she told you? It's what multiple people observed. He sat down behind his desk and gestured for me to take a seat. I remained standing. Look, I'm not saying you did anything wrong from a compliance standpoint. But you need to understand how this looks. We have a hierarchy here for a reason. When people skip levels and create their own channels to clients, it makes the organization unstable. The organization was already unstable. The project was failing because the implementation plan didn't match reality. Someone had to say that, and apparently the only person willing to do it was me. Derek studied me for a moment. You've changed. 6 months ago you would never have spoken to me like this. 6 months ago I still believed that doing good work quietly would be enough. I was wrong. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in that same gesture Vanessa always used. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to lead the DoD implementation. You'll have whatever resources you need. But you're going to report to Vanessa, and you're going to keep her informed of every decision before you make it. The client may want you in charge operationally, but internally, the chain of command remains the same. Can you work within those parameters? It was a trap. He was asking me to accept a structure where I would do all the work and make all the decisions, but Vanessa would still have veto power and the ability to take credit. It was exactly the arrangement I'd been living with for 6 years, just with slightly different packaging. And if I refused, he would find a way to remove me from the project entirely, contract language or not. Corporate lawyers could always find loopholes. Can I think about it? I asked. You have until tomorrow morning. This isn't a negotiation, Rachel. It's reality. You're talented, but you're still an employee of this firm, and employees work within the structure or they leave. Your choice. I left his office feeling the weight of that ultimatum pressing down on me. I had won something significant today. The Secretary of Defense had publicly recognized my value and given me authority I'd never had before. But that authority only mattered within the context of the government contract. Inside Apex, I was still subordinate to people who saw me as a threat to their own status. And now I had to decide whether I could live with that division, doing meaningful work outside the building while being diminished inside it, or whether I needed to make a more fundamental change. I drove home in silence, my mind churning through possibilities. When I got to my apartment, I poured a glass of water and stood on my small balcony watching the sun set over the desert. The sky was doing that thing it does in winter, turning shades of orange and pink and purple that feel almost impossible. Somewhere out there, Secretary Garrison was probably in a much larger office making decisions that affected thousands of lives. And somehow, through a series of small acts of decency, buying coffee for a stranger, I had connected with someone who had the power to change my trajectory entirely. But power given can also be power taken away. If I stayed at Apex under Derek's terms, would be dependent on their tolerance. The moment the DoD contract was complete, or the moment I became more trouble than I was worth, they could marginalize me again. The only difference was that now I knew what it felt like to be seen, to have my work acknowledged by someone who mattered. Going back to invisibility after that would be unbearable. My phone buzzed. Another message from the number I now knew belonged to Secretary Garrison. My assistant will call you tomorrow to schedule a meeting. Come to the Pentagon. There are some things we need to discuss in person. And Rachel, don't let them make you small again. You're done with that. I stared at those words. Don't let them make you small again. He understood. Of course he understood. He'd spent months sitting in a coffee shop watching people rush past him without a second glance, being invisible despite everything he'd done and everything he was. He knew what it felt like to be diminished. And he'd recognized in me someone experiencing the same thing. I texted back. I'll be there. And thank you. His response came immediately. Don't thank me. You earned this. I just opened a door you were already standing in front of. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, playing out scenarios. If I accepted Derek's terms, I could lead the implementation, rebuild the project, and deliver something that actually worked. That mattered. That was real value. But I would spend every day fighting internal battles with Vanessa, justifying my decisions to people who wanted me to fail so they could reassert their authority. Eventually, I would burn out or they would find an excuse to remove me. The project might succeed, but I would still end up back where I started. If I refused Derek's terms, I would probably be fired. They would find a procedural reason, something about insubordination or failure to follow company policy. I would lose my salary, my health insurance, my stability. But I would also be free of a system that had spent 6 years teaching me that my value was only what other people decided to acknowledge. And I would still have the relationship with Secretary Garrison, still have the trust of the Pentagon officials I'd worked with, still have my expertise and my reputation outside of Apex. Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed and opened my laptop. I pulled up the document I'd created over the holidays, the 40-page record of everything I'd contributed to Apex over 6 years. I read through it slowly, not with anger or bitterness, but with clarity. This was what I'd built. This was proof that I hadn't imagined my own competence, that I wasn't crazy for believing I deserved recognition. And it was also proof that I didn't need Apex to validate my worth. The work spoke for itself. I opened a new document and started writing. Not an angry email, not a manifesto about injustice. Just a simple resignation letter that stated clearly and professionally that I was leaving to pursue opportunities that better aligned with my skills and professional goals. I thanked them for the experience, wished them success, and provided 4 weeks' notice to ensure a smooth transition of the DoD contract to whatever leadership structure they chose to implement. When I finished, the sky outside was starting to lighten. Dawn in the desert comes fast, the darkness giving way to gold in a matter of minutes. I saved the letter and closed my laptop. I would give it to Derek this morning, before he could corner me with his ultimatum. I would take control of the narrative for the first time in my career. And then I would drive to the Pentagon and find out what Secretary Garrison wanted to discuss. Because for the first time in 6 years, I was done playing by rules designed to keep me in place. I was done being small. Whatever came next would be on my terms, or it wouldn't be at all. I arrived at the office before anyone else. The building was quiet in that particular way early mornings have, when the hum of computers and fluorescent lights sounds louder than it should. I went straight to Derek's office and slid the envelope containing my resignation letter under his door. No ceremony, no dramatic confrontation. Just a clean exit on my terms before he could impose his. Then I went to my desk and started organizing files. Everything related to the DoD contract went into a secure folder that I would hand over properly. My personal research, the frameworks I'd developed over the years, the relationships I'd built independent of Apex, those stayed with me. By the time people started arriving around 8, I had already packed 2 boxes of personal items and was working through transition notes. Vanessa was the first to notice. She walked past my desk, stopped, backed up, and stared at the boxes. "What are you doing?" "Preparing for a transition. I've resigned." Derek should have the letter by now. Her expression cycled through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been panic. "You can't resign. You're in the middle of the DoD contract. Which is why I'm providing 4 weeks' notice and complete documentation of everything related to the project. Whoever takes over will have everything they need. Rachel, if this is about yesterday, about what I said, we can work through that. You're emotional right now, but you need to think about your career. Walking away from Apex, especially right after getting client recognition, that's going to raise questions. It'll look unstable." I stopped typing and looked at her directly. "Vanessa, I've spent 6 years making you look good. I've written your presentations, solved your problems, and watched you take credit for work I did. Yesterday, for the first time, someone with actual authority recognized that. And your response was to threaten me and try to put me back in a subordinate position where you could continue to control the narrative. I'm not emotional. I'm clear. Clearer than I've been in a long time. This is about ego," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You can't handle not being the center of attention. One meeting with a senior official and suddenly you think you're more important than the team. No, this is about reality. The reality is that I built the foundation for this company's biggest success, and you've spent months erasing my contributions. The reality is that the client trusts me, not because of politics or performance, but because I've consistently delivered accurate information and solved real problems. And the reality is that I don't need to stay here to do meaningful work. Derek emerged from his office, the envelope in his hand. He looked at me, then at Vanessa, and his jaw tightened. My office. Both of you. We followed him in. He closed the door and held up the resignation letter. 4 weeks' notice. Very professional. Mind telling me what prompted this decision, Rachel? I think you know. You gave me an ultimatum yesterday. Report to Vanessa, accept a structure where I do the work but she maintains authority, or leave. I'm choosing to leave. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. You told me employees work within the structure or they go. So I'm going. He set the letter down on his desk and studied me with that same calculating expression from yesterday. Let's talk numbers. What would it take to get you to stay? A raise? A title change? We can make you a senior director, report directly to me instead of Vanessa. You'd have more autonomy. It's not about money or titles. It's about whether I can do work that matters without constantly fighting internal battles over who gets credit. The answer here is no. So I'm finding somewhere the answer is yes. Vanessa spoke up. She's going to the Pentagon. She's going to leverage her relationship with Garrison to get a government position. This whole thing was calculated. I don't have a government position lined up, I said. I have a meeting with the secretary this afternoon because he asked to discuss the contract implementation. Beyond that, I have no idea what's next. But I know it won't involve working for people who see my competence as a threat. Derek leaned back in his chair. You're making a mistake. Apex gave you opportunities. We invested in your development. And now, right when that investment is paying off, you're walking away. That's going to follow you. What opportunities? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't soften them. I've been here 6 years. In that time, I've been passed over for 3 promotions. I've had my work repackaged and presented by other people at least a dozen times. I've built relationships with clients who specifically ask for me, and I've been told that's not leadership, that's just technical work. So tell me, Derek, what opportunities did you actually give me? The opportunity to stay quiet and be useful? The silence that followed was heavy. Derek and Vanessa exchanged a glance. They knew I was right. They'd probably always known. But admitting it would mean acknowledging that the system they benefited from was fundamentally unfair, and people rarely acknowledge truths that undermine their own position. Fine, Derek said finally. If this is your decision, we'll process the resignation. But understand that we're going to need extensive knowledge transfer. You don't get to just dump files and disappear. You're going to train whoever we assign to replace you. I'll do a thorough transition. That's why I gave 4 weeks. But I'm not training someone to take credit for frameworks I developed. I'll transfer knowledge about the DoD contract and active client relationships. My methodologies, my personal research, those come with me. That's company property. Everything you developed while employed here belongs to Apex. We can let the lawyers sort that out if you want. But I've kept detailed records of what I created on company time versus my own time. Most of the analytical frameworks you're referring to, I developed nights and weekends on my personal laptop using my own resources. You're welcome to challenge that, but it'll get expensive and complicated. It was a bluff, partially. Some of the work had been done on company time. But enough of it was genuinely mine that a legal fight would be messy, and Derek knew that messy fights with departing employees created exactly the kind of instability that made clients nervous. Especially clients like the Department of Defense who valued discretion. He made a decision. I could see it in his face, the shift from trying to control the situation to trying to contain the damage. 4 weeks. Full knowledge transfer on active contracts. You maintain confidentiality about proprietary processes. And you do not poach clients or employees. Those are the terms. Agreed. Then we're done here. He picked up the resignation letter and filed it in a drawer. HR will reach out about exit procedures. Vanessa, let's discuss transition planning. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. There was still anxiety, still uncertainty about what came next, but underneath all that was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. The freedom that comes from making a choice based on your own values rather than fear of consequences. The rest of the morning passed in a strange limbo. People had clearly heard something was happening, and the office buzzed with speculation. Kevin Walsh stopped by my desk around 11. Is it true you're leaving? Yes. Because of what happened yesterday? Because of Vanessa? Because it's time. I've learned everything I'm going to learn here. He sat down in the chair beside my desk, lowering his voice. Look, I know I said yesterday that you just have to accept how things work. But honestly, I'm glad you didn't. Watching what happened on that call, seeing someone finally get recognized for actually doing the work instead of just performing leadership, that mattered. You made a lot of people here realize we've been accepting things we shouldn't. So what are you going to do about it? He laughed, but it was uncomfortable. Nothing, probably. I've got a mortgage and kids in private school. I can't afford to take stands. But I wanted you to know that some of us see what you did. And we respect it, even if we can't follow. After he left, I thought about that. The distance between seeing injustice and doing something about it. Most people lived in that gap, understanding what was wrong but feeling trapped by the practical realities of bills and responsibilities and the fear of losing what little security they had. I didn't judge Kevin for that. 6 months ago, I was him. The only difference was that something had finally pushed me past the point where fear mattered more than dignity. At 1 o'clock, I left for the Pentagon. The drive from Phoenix to Washington would normally take 4 hours by plane, but Secretary Garrison's office had arranged a military transport that cut the time significantly. I'd never been on a government aircraft before. It was smaller than a commercial jet, more utilitarian, with none of the pretense of comfort. Just efficient transport for people who had places to be. I used the flight time to prepare. I reviewed every document related to the DoD contract, refreshed my memory on the technical details, and tried to anticipate what Secretary Garrison wanted to discuss. But underneath all that preparation was a current of nervousness that had nothing to do with professional competence. I was about to have a face-to-face conversation with someone I'd been buying coffee for, someone I'd talked with about everything except the fact that he was one of the most powerful people in government. The intimacy of those conversations felt different now, weighted with implications I hadn't understood at the time. The Pentagon is massive in a way that's difficult to comprehend until you're inside it. Miles of corridors, thousands of offices, the physical embodiment of bureaucratic power. Secretary Garrison's office was on the outer ring, 3rd floor, with windows that looked out toward the Potomac. His assistant, a woman in her 40s with efficient professionalism, greeted me and asked me to wait. I sat in a reception area that felt designed to intimidate. Photos of previous secretaries of defense lined the walls. There were awards, commendations, historical artifacts from various conflicts. Everything communicated weight, legacy, importance. And I was just Rachel Bennett from Phoenix, who'd spent 6 years being told she wasn't important enough to matter. The door opened and Tom, Secretary Garrison, stepped out. He was wearing a suit, but he still carried the cane, and his presence was somehow both more and less intimidating than I'd expected. More because now I understood who he actually was. Less because his expression when he saw me was warm, almost amused. Rachel. Thank you for coming. I hope the flight wasn't too uncomfortable. It was fine. Thank you for arranging it. Come in. We have a lot to talk about. His office was surprisingly modest given his position. A desk covered in papers, bookshelves filled with policy texts and military history, a small sitting area with 2 chairs that looked well used. He gestured to one of the chairs and took the other himself, setting his cane aside. So, he said. I imagine you have questions. A few. Starting with why you didn't tell me who you were. He smiled. Would you have talked to me the same way if you'd known? Would you have bought me coffee and sat down and told me what you really thought about how systems fail people? Probably not. Exactly. I've spent 40 years in environments where people perform for me. They tell me what they think I want to hear, or what makes them look good, or what advances their agenda. Very few people are honest when they're talking to someone with power. You were honest because you thought I was nobody. That told me more about who you are than any resume or interview ever could. You were testing me. I was getting to know you. There's a difference. And I wasn't lying about being a veteran or about my injury. That's all real. I just didn't mention the current job title. I sat back in the chair, processing that. The morning you were talking to that man in the suit, before I bought your coffee the first time. That was about me, wasn't it? That was my deputy. I'd asked him to look into Apex Solutions and a senior analyst named Rachel Bennett who kept showing up in the correspondence about our procurement reform initiative. He told me you were the person actually doing the work, but that you had no formal authority and weren't getting any recognition. I was curious about why someone with your track record was still stuck in a mid-level position. So you came to Starbucks. I come to that Starbucks most mornings when I'm in Phoenix anyway. I have family here, and I use the visits as a chance to clear my head away from Washington. But yes, after that conversation, I paid more attention. I watched how you carried yourself. I noticed you came in early, always looked tired, like you were carrying weight nobody else could see. And then you bought my coffee. Not to network, not because you knew who I was, but because you saw someone you thought deserved a small kindness. That's rare. It was just coffee. We keep coming back to that, don't we? He leaned forward slightly. Rachel, people reveal themselves in small actions. The way you treated a stranger you thought was invisible told me how you'd treat people if you had power. With decency. That's the quality I need most right now, and it's the hardest one to find. Why? He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the river. Because the Department of Defense is massive, complicated, and full of people who are very good at protecting their own interests while appearing to serve the mission. I've been in this role for 18 months, and I've spent most of that time trying to identify who I can actually trust to execute reforms that need to happen. People who won't just tell me what sounds good, but who will tell me what's true even when it's uncomfortable. You've been doing that for 2 years with my procurement team. They trust you because you've never lied to them, never oversold a solution, never tried to advance your career at the expense of actually solving problems. I didn't know they felt that way. That's part of why they do. You weren't performing trustworthiness. You were just being competent and honest. Do you know how rare that combination is in this environment? I didn't know how to respond to that. For 6 years, I'd been told implicitly and explicitly that my approach was wrong, that I needed to be more political, more strategic about self-promotion, more willing to play the game. And now someone at the highest level of government was telling me that the qualities I'd been criticized for were actually what made me valuable. I asked you here because I want to offer you a position, he continued. Not on the contracting side. On my team. I need someone who can look at procurement reform, really look at it without the institutional biases, and tell me what's actually broken and how to fix it. Someone the career staff will respect because you understand the work, but who isn't embedded in the internal politics. Someone I can trust to give me honest assessments. The offer hung in the air between us. A job at the Pentagon, working directly for the Secretary of Defense. It was the kind of opportunity that people spend entire careers building toward. It was also terrifying in its scope and visibility. No more hiding in the background. No more being the person who did the work while others took credit. I would be the person accountable for outcomes, visible to everyone. What would the role be specifically? Senior Advisor for Procurement Reform. You'd have a small team, direct access to me and the Deputy Secretary, and the authority to request information from any office in the department. Your job would be to identify inefficiencies, propose solutions, and help implement changes. It's not easy work. You'll make enemies with people who benefit from the current system. You'll be challenged constantly. But you'll also have real power to make things better. Why me? There are people with more experience, more credentials, who've been working in defense policy for decades. Because those people are part of the system that created the problems. They can't see what's broken because they've spent their careers learning to work around it rather than fixing it. You're an outsider who understands the insider dynamics. That's exactly what I need. I thought about Apex, about Derek's ultimatum and Vanessa's attempts to contain me. I thought about the resignation letter sitting in a drawer and the 4 weeks of transition work ahead of me. I thought about what Kevin had said, about the gap between seeing injustice and doing something about it. Can I be honest about something? I asked. Please. I'm terrified. Not of the work, I can do the work. But of being visible. I've spent 6 years learning how to survive by being invisible. Stepping into a role like this, being accountable at that level, having people scrutinize every decision, that's the opposite of everything I've trained myself to do. Secretary Garrison returned to his chair and looked at me with that same steady gaze I'd seen across the coffee shop table. Fear is reasonable. This job will be hard in ways you can't anticipate right now. But here's what I know about you. You've been doing hard things invisibly for years. You've been carrying weight without recognition, solving problems without reward, and maintaining your integrity in an environment that punished it. That took more courage than most people ever have to show. Now I'm offering you a chance to do hard things visibly, to use your skills in a context where they'll actually be valued. The fear doesn't go away, but the purpose becomes clearer. What if I fail? Then you fail honestly, which is better than succeeding through deception. But I don't think you will. I've watched you work. I've seen how you think about problems. And I've read every report you've filed with my procurement team over the past 2 years. You're ready for this, even if you don't feel ready. I sat with that for a moment. Ready. I'd spent so long being told I wasn't ready, that I needed more experience or better political skills or whatever excuse people used to justify keeping me in place. And now someone who actually understood the work was telling me I was ready. Not because I'd learned to perform confidence, but because I'd demonstrated competence. I need some time to think about it, I said. Of course. Take a week. Talk to people you trust. Consider what you actually want your career to look like, not what you've been told it should look like. And Rachel, one more thing. I've already spoken with the DoD General Counsel about the Apex contract. Regardless of whether you take this position, I'm insisting that you remain the lead on that implementation. If Apex has a problem with that arrangement, we'll find another contractor. Your expertise is too valuable to waste on internal corporate politics. That was the moment I understood the full scope of what had changed. 2 days ago, I was an invisible analyst whose work was attributed to other people. Now, the Secretary of Defense was restructuring contracts to ensure I could do my job without interference. The shift was dizzying. I left the Pentagon as the sun was setting, the building's massive structure casting long shadows across the parking lot. The flight back to Phoenix gave me time to think, to try to process what had just happened. By the time I landed, it was late evening. I drove home through empty streets, the city quiet in that way it gets after the day's shift ends but before the nightlife begins. My apartment felt different when I walked in. Smaller somehow, like I'd outgrown it without noticing. I made tea and sat on my balcony looking at the lights of downtown Phoenix in the distance. Somewhere out there, Vanessa was probably strategizing about how to minimize the damage of my departure. Derek was probably calculating the financial impact. And my former colleagues were probably gossiping about what had really happened, about whether I'd burned bridges or built them. But none of that felt as important as it would have a week ago. Because I'd been offered something I'd spent 6 years chasing without realizing it. Not recognition for its own sake, but the opportunity to do meaningful work in a context where that work would actually matter. Where the system wouldn't fight me at every turn. Where my competence would be an asset rather than a threat. I still didn't know if I would take the job. There were practical considerations, logistics of moving to Washington, questions about salary and benefits and whether I could actually handle the pressure of that level of visibility. But underneath all those practical concerns was a simpler question. Did I have the courage to step into the light after spending so long in the shadows? My phone buzzed with a text from Nina Patel, a mentor I'd worked with early in my career who'd since moved to a think tank. Heard through the grapevine that interesting things are happening. Call me when you can. I called. She answered on the second ring. Rachel. Tell me everything. I walked her through the past 48 hours. The video call, Secretary Garrison's revelation, the resignation, the Pentagon meeting, the job offer. When I finished, there was a long pause. So let me get this straight, Nina said finally. You've been buying coffee for the Secretary of Defense without knowing it. He's offered you a senior advisor position, and you're hesitating because you're scared? When you put it that way, it sounds stupid. It doesn't sound stupid. It sounds human. But Rachel, I've known you for 8 years. I've watched you do brilliant work and get passed over again and again because you didn't know how to advocate for yourself. This isn't you needing to advocate. This is someone with real power recognizing your value and offering you a platform to use it. If you turn this down because you're scared of being visible, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. What if I'm not good enough? You are good enough. You've always been good enough. The only person who didn't know that was you. After we hung up, I sat with those words. You've always been good enough. It was such a simple statement, but it cut through years of doubt and self-criticism. I'd spent so long trying to prove my worth to people who were never going to acknowledge it that I'd forgotten to acknowledge it myself. I'd let other people's assessments define my sense of competence, and because those assessments were designed to keep me small, I'd stayed small. But I wasn't small. I'd never been small. I'd just been working in a system that benefited from making me believe I was. The next morning, I went back to the Starbucks on Central Avenue. Tom wasn't there, of course. He was probably in Washington dealing with actual national security issues. But I ordered 2 coffees anyway, drank one, and left the other on his usual table with a note on the napkin. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. I think I'm ready to be seen now. Then I went to the office and started planning my transition in earnest. Not because I had to, but because doing things well mattered to me regardless of who was watching. Over the next week, I documented everything related to the DoD contract and active client relationships. I met with the team members who would be taking over various aspects of my work and walked them through not just what to do, but why certain approaches worked better than others. Vanessa tried twice to have conversations about my decision to leave. Both times, I kept things professional and brief. There was nothing left to say. She understood why I was going, even if she'd never admit it. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after my Pentagon meeting, I called the number Secretary Garrison had given me. His assistant answered and put me through immediately. Rachel. Have you made a decision? Yes, sir. I'd like to accept the position. When do you need me to start? There was a smile in his voice when he responded. How does 3 weeks sound? That gives you time to finish your transition at Apex and relocate to Washington. 3 weeks works. Good. My team will send over the official paperwork and logistics. And Rachel? Welcome to the fight. It's going to be harder than you think, but I believe you're exactly who we need. After the call ended, I sat at my desk feeling the weight and lightness of that decision simultaneously. I was leaving Phoenix, leaving the comfortable invisibility I'd built over 6 years, leaving the safety of knowing exactly what each day would look like. I was stepping into uncertainty, visibility, and a level of responsibility that terrified me. But I was also stepping into possibility. The possibility that my work would matter on a scale I'd never imagined. The possibility that I could help build systems that actually functioned for the people they were meant to serve. The possibility that competence and integrity might actually be rewarded in a context designed to value them. I thought about that morning weeks ago when I'd bought coffee for a stranger, not knowing he was anything more than a veteran who looked forgotten. That small act of decency had changed everything, not because it was calculated but because it was genuine. And now I was being offered the chance to bring that same genuine approach to work that could affect millions of people. The sunset that evening was particularly beautiful, the desert sky doing its impossible color show one more time. I stood on my balcony knowing that soon I'd be watching different sunsets from a different city, building a different life. The fear was still there, but it had company now. Excitement, purpose, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the universe does keep score in ways you never see coming. All because I bought coffee for someone who turned out to matter. Or maybe he always mattered, and I was just the first person in a long time who noticed. 3 months later, I stood in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon briefing a room full of generals and senior defense officials about procurement inefficiencies in the naval supply chain. My analysis had identified over $200 million in redundant contracts and outdated inventory systems that were costing taxpayers while failing to deliver what sailors actually needed. The room was silent as I walked through the data, not because I was performing authority, but because the work was undeniable. When I finished, a 2-star general who'd been skeptical of my appointment raised his hand. "Ms. Bennett, I've been in logistics for 30 years. Why didn't anyone catch this before?" Because the people who understood the operational realities weren't in rooms where decisions got made, and the people making decisions weren't asking the right questions. "We're fixing that now." Secretary Garrison, sitting at the head of the table, nodded. "Questions?" When no one spoke, he continued. "Good. Rachel's recommendations are approved. Let's implement within the quarter. Next item." After the meeting, as people filed out, a Navy captain approached me. That was impressive. I'd been trying to get someone to look at those supply issues for 3 years. "How'd you cut through the bureaucracy so fast?" I didn't cut through it. I just asked people on the ground what they actually needed instead of assuming the system already knew. He smiled. "Sounds simple when you say it that way. Most solutions are simple. We just make them complicated to protect the status quo." Walking back to my office, I passed the photo wall of former secretaries of defense that had intimidated me on my first visit. They didn't intimidate me anymore. Not because I'd become like them, but because I'd learned that real authority comes from doing work that matters, not from titles or positions or the performance of importance. My phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "Saw your name in the Defense News article about procurement reform. Senior Advisor Rachel Bennett leads comprehensive overhaul. Look at you being visible." I smiled and texted back. "Still getting used to it." Her response came immediately. "Good. Stay uncomfortable. That's where growth lives." That evening, I met Secretary Garrison for coffee at a small place near the Pentagon, nothing like the corporate environments where decisions usually got made. He ordered black coffee, same as always, and we sat by the window watching rush hour traffic crawl past. "How are you holding up?" he asked. 3 months in, the shine usually starts wearing off and the reality sets in. "I'm tired," I admitted. But it's different from how I was tired at Apex. There, I was exhausted from fighting to be heard. Here, I'm exhausted from actually doing the work. That feels better somehow. That feels better somehow. It is better. Exhaustion from meaningful effort beats exhaustion from meaningless struggle every time. He paused, stirring his coffee. "I heard from your old firm, by the way. Derek reached out asking if there was any possibility of consulting work now that you're established here." "What did you tell him?" "That we have the consultants we need. Some bridges are meant to stay burned." I thought about that. About Derek and Vanessa and all the people at Apex who'd spent years benefiting from my invisibility. Part of me had wondered if I'd feel vindicated when they realized what they'd lost. But mostly I just felt relieved to be gone. Vindication required still caring about their opinion, and I'd finally stopped caring. "I saw Tom at the coffee shop last week," Secretary Garrison said, using his own first name with a slight smile. "The veteran you used to buy coffee for. He wanted me to tell you thank you. You're the veteran I bought coffee for." "I know. But that version of me, the one sitting alone reading the newspaper before you knew who I was, he needed to know someone saw him as worth a small kindness. That mattered more than you realize." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd found each other through accident and decency and the strange way the universe sometimes rewards people who do small things for the right reasons. "I need to tell you something," I said. "When you first offered me this job, I almost said no. I was terrified of being visible, of failing publicly, of not being enough. And some days I still feel that fear. But I've learned something. Being invisible didn't protect me. It just made it easier for other people to pretend I didn't exist. Being visible is scary, but at least when I fail now, it'll be because I tried to do something that mattered, not because I stayed quiet and accepted less than I deserved. Secretary Garrison set down his coffee cup and looked at me with that same steady gaze that had seen through my invisibility from the start. You're not going to fail, Rachel. Not because you're perfect, but because you're honest. In an environment full of people protecting their positions, your willingness to just tell the truth and do good work makes you more valuable than you understand. Don't lose that. Don't let this place turn you into someone who performs importance instead of actually being important. I'll try not to. That's all any of us can do. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways, him back to decisions that affected national security, me back to an apartment that still didn't quite feel like home but was getting closer. Washington was different from Phoenix, faster and colder and more intense, but I was learning to navigate it. Learning that I could be visible without losing myself. Learning that the qualities I'd been told were weaknesses, honesty and directness and refusal to play political games, were actually my greatest strengths in an environment starving for authenticity. 6 years ago, I'd been invisible at a company that took everything I built and gave me nothing in return. Today, I stood in rooms where my voice carried weight and my work changed outcomes that mattered. The distance between those two realities was measured not in titles or salary, but in something simpler and more profound. The decision to stop accepting invisibility as the price of having a job. Sometimes the universe does keep score. Sometimes small acts of decency, buying coffee for a stranger who looks forgotten, open doors you didn't know existed. And sometimes the person you're really saving when you show that kindness isn't the stranger at all. It's yourself, reminding yourself that you still believe people have value even when the world tries to teach you otherwise. I bought coffee for a disabled veteran at Starbucks. I had no idea he was the Secretary of Defense. But more importantly, I had no idea that simple act of seeing someone would teach me how to finally see myself. Not as the invisible analyst in the background, but as someone whose work mattered, whose voice deserved to be heard, whose presence made a difference. And that recognition, that shift from invisible to essential, didn't come from performing confidence or playing corporate games or learning to take credit I didn't earn. It came from doing good work quietly until someone with actual wisdom recognized it. It came from refusing to accept that my value was whatever other people decided to acknowledge. It came from buying coffee for a stranger and sitting down to talk, not because I wanted something from him, but because decency mattered more than strategy. The lights of Washington glowed outside my window, a city built on power and politics and the constant negotiation of who matters and who doesn't. But I'd learned something that no amount of political maneuvering could teach. You matter not because someone with authority says you do, but because the work you do and the way you treat people reflects values worth having. Everything else is just noise. I bought coffee for someone I thought was nobody. He turned out to be somebody. But the real revelation wasn't about him. It was about me. About learning that I'd been somebody all along, even when everyone around me treated me like nobody. About finding the courage to walk away from invisibility and into a life where my presence actually counted. That's worth more than any title, any salary, any recognition from people who never valued me in the first place. That's freedom. And it started with $7.50 and the simple belief that everyone deserves to be seen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.